homeless, divorced. Then, $1 billion empire. The world dismissed her. A single mother on welfare. She couldn't afford hope. Discover the 3 unbreakable rules that fueled her impossible comeback. Rule number 1.
Edinburgh, 1993. The fairy tale didn't start in a castle. It started in a cramped, unheated flat with peeling wallpaper and a screaming infant. No one saw J.K. Rowling as a genius back then. She was a statistic, a divorced single mother on state benefits, jobless and clinically depressed, staring at a future that looked like a black hole. Society looked at her and saw a burden. She looked in the mirror and saw a total failure. When your reality is so dark, you can't even imagine a light at the end of the tunnel. She was surviving on less than £70 a week. Buying a single cup of coffee was a calculated financial risk. But she didn't write Harry Potter to become a billionaire. She wrote because it was the only way to keep her sanity intact.
She wrote because it was the only way to keep her sanity intact. She took her own suffocating depression and turned it into the Dementors, monsters that drain hope from the soul. Most people assume that finishing the manuscript was the moment everything changed. It wasn't. Because what happened the moment she typed the end wasn't a celebration. It was the start of a rejection so brutal it would have silenced anyone else forever. Tell me in the comments, what is the biggest obstacle standing in your way right now?
Imagine typing out 90,000 words on an old manual typewriter, not once, but multiple times, because you cannot afford the cost of a photocopy. That was Rowling's reality. She sent that manuscript to 12 different publishing houses, and 12 times it was thrown into the rejection pile. One publisher didn't just say no, they kept the binder it came in, because even the plastic folder was worth more to them than her story. The rejection wasn't just professional, it was a direct threat to her survival. She was living in a mouse-infested flat in Edinburgh, surviving on state benefits that barely covered food. Every stamp she bought to mail a query letter was a calculated financial risk that literally took food out of her own mouth.
She later described this period as being as poor as it is possible to be in modern Britain without being homeless. The stress was so toxic that her doctor diagnosed her with clinical depression, a grey numbness she described not as sadness but as the complete absence of hope. Even when a small publisher, Bloomsbury, finally showed interest, the victory was incredibly fragile. Her agent, Christopher Little, called her with the good news, but immediately followed it with a crushing warning. You do realize you will never make a fortune out of children's books. She was offered a measly £1,500 advance. It was a lifeline, but a thin one that barely covered 2 months of rent. By every logical metric, she was a failure. By every logical metric, she was a failure. She was jobless, alone, and the industry experts had just told her that her life's work was financially worthless. But this is where the story defies logic. Most people think rock bottom is the end, the place where dreams go to die. For Rowling, hitting the absolute bottom didn't destroy her ambition, it did the exact opposite. It gave her an unfair advantage that no billionaire possesses.
We usually imagine failure as a cage, a place where ambition goes to die. But in that freezing Edinburgh apartment, Rowling discovered a paradoxical truth that most successful people never admit. The cage didn't lock her in, it locked the distractions out. She realized that her greatest fear, total insolvency, had already happened, and she was still standing. She still had a daughter, she still had an old typewriter. This brings us to the first critical shift, the 0-point liberation. When you truly have nothing to lose, you suddenly lose the paralyzing fear of consequences. The social shame that stops 99% of creators from ever starting, it vanished for her. She wasn't writing for critics, for market trends, or for a paycheck anymore.
She wasn't writing for critics, for market trends, or for a paycheck anymore. Here is the reframe that changes everything. Failure is not the opposite of success. It is the mechanism that strips away the inessential. Rowling stopped pretending to be anything other than what she was. Rock bottom became the solid foundation on which she rebuilt her life, simply because it was the only thing that couldn't be taken away from her. The poverty wasn't just a barrier, it was a filter that left her with the sheer, unadulterated focus required to build a universe. But liberation alone doesn't pay the rent. Having nothing to lose is just a spark. It doesn't actually put words on the page or money in the bank. Having nothing to lose is just a spark. It doesn't actually put words on the page or money in the bank. To turn that fearless mindset into a billion-dollar reality, she had to combine this psychological freedom with a brutal, almost mechanical daily discipline that defies the myth of inspiration.
This brings us to the core mechanism of her ascent. Rule number 2, the power of weaponized imagination. Most people think imagination is just daydreaming to escape a harsh reality. For Rowling, it was the opposite. She didn't use Hogwarts to hide from her poverty. She used it to restructure her future. While the world looked at her and saw a jobless single mother, she looked in the mirror and saw the architect of a new universe. She used imagination not as a retreat, but as a blueprint. However, a blueprint is useless without construction, which leads to rule number 3, unrelenting persistence. Rowling didn't just write when inspiration struck. She treated the work with a mechanical, almost obsessive dedication. She typed the original manuscript on an old manual typewriter. When she couldn't afford the fees to photocopy it for submission, she didn't quit. She sat down and typed the entire 90,000-word book out again, twice. This answers the question we started with. How do you bridge the gap between homeless and billionaire? You do the grueling work that others find too tedious to touch. The impact of this combination was tested immediately. 12 major publishing houses rejected Harry Potter. 12 times industry experts looked at her life's work and threw it in the trash. But because her imagination had already validated the value of her story, and her persistence had calloused her against rejection, she refused to stop.
But because her imagination had already validated the value of her story, and her persistence had calloused her against rejection, she refused to stop. The moral here is brutal but necessary. True imagination is the ability to see a future so clearly that the current rejection letters feel like lies. It creates an immunity to failure. And yet, here is the twist that makes her victory even more ironic. When Bloomsbury finally said yes, the editor sat her down and gave her a grave warning. "You'll never make any money out of children's books, Jo." He genuinely advised her to get a teaching job to survive. He had no idea that the woman sitting across from him wasn't just a writer, but an alchemist who had already turned her rock bottom into the foundation of an empire. That warning would become the most ironic footnote in literary history. Harry Potter didn't just succeed, it ignited a global phenomenon. Within years, the woman who was advised to get a teaching job to survive had become the world's first billionaire author. But the billions are not the takeaway here. The triumph wasn't the money, it was the method. Rowling's comeback reveals a powerful action plan for anyone at rock bottom. Utilize the freedom of failure. When the worst has already happened, fear loses its grip. You gain a radical focus that comfort can never provide. She didn't succeed in spite of her poverty. She succeeded because she used it to strip away the inessential. This is your strategy. Stop viewing your lowest point as a grave. View it as a foundation. View it as a foundation. It is the only place solid enough to build an empire that lasts. The magic wasn't in the wand. It was in the refusal to put it down. J.K. Rowling's story truly highlights the immense strength within us. Which of her 3 rules spoke most to your own journey? If this wisdom resonated and you want more insights to empower your life, please like and subscribe. For another icon's incredible comeback story, click the video on your screen.